Welcome to World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, all eyes on climate change skeptic. U.S. President Donald Trump and he attends the first G7 summit. Can the world leaders convince him of climate change is real? Google computer AlphaGo has defeated the world's top Go player. Is this a sign that humans need to adapt to a world where AI surpass us? And we start from Sicily, where G7 leaders meet Friday, determined to put on a display of united resolve in the fight against terrorism, while U.S. President Donald Trump will face pressure at his first summit of major industrialized nations from allies eager to promote free trade and safeguard international accords on climate change.
Building foundations of renewed trust. With British Prime Minister Theresa May and Donald Trump among four new faces in the club of the world's major democracies, the gathering in Italy is being billed as a key test of how serious the new U.S. administration is about implementing its radical policy agenda, particularly on climate change.
So my hope is that there will be no hasty decision on the subject from the United States of America, because our collective responsibility is to fulfill this global commitment, which is the first.
During his election campaign, professed climate skeptic Donald Trump promised to exit the 2015 UN Pact on limiting global warming. And he signed an executive order this March which loosened government restrictions on mining, putting the future of the Paris Agreement at risk.
I am taking historic steps to lift the restrictions on American energy, to reverse government intrusion, and to cancel job-killing regulations. Going to have clean coal, really clean coal.
Under President Barack Obama, the U.S., the world's second biggest carbon emitter, pledged to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025. U.S. withdrawal from the 196-nation Paris Agreement would be a real blow to climate diplomacy. The historic 2015 pact was made possible by a hard-fought agreement negotiated between Washington and Beijing.
All the countries, all the world leaders agreed on a plan to actually solve a deep climate and social crisis. But what we currently see, including with the G7 members, is they don't follow their responsibilities and they don't do their commitment they gave with that Paris Agreement. Currently you see a 40% emission reductions by 2030. That's far from enough.
A meeting of G7 energy ministers in Rome in April ended without a joint statement. The United States chose not to endorse a text that reaffirmed their commitment to the Paris Climate Change Agreement, so all eyes will once again turn towards U.S. President Trump, whether he will withdraw the U.S. commitment to the global agreement to curb greenhouse gas emissions.
So what are the climate change policy prospects at the G7 summit? What are likely to be the topics these leaders are going to discuss? Will there be satisfying results for everyone? Let's loop in tonight's panelists. Right here in Beijing, we have Professor Qi Ye, professor from the School of Public Policy and Management at Tsinghua University. Welcome to our program, sir. Joining us in Washington, D.C., we invited Ethan Zindler, who is a senior associate at the Energy and National Security Program at CSIS. He's also head of the policy analysis at Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Joining us also in London, we are having Chris Littlecott, the program leader of the E3G London office. E3G is an independent climate change think tank. Welcome to our program, all of you gentlemen. May I start with you, Mr. Zindler? I know a lot in Washington are watching very closely about the G7 summit this time. What do you think? Climate change skeptics, at least that's what President Trump was like during his campaign. Will he continue on that path further?
Well, it's really an open question at this point. I think we're all waiting to see. I think one of the most important decisions of his presidency has not officially been made yet, which is whether or not the president would like the United States to remain in the Paris Climate Agreement. There is certainly a lot of internal debate within his administration at the moment, but we do not yet know exactly what the U.S. position is going to be on this agreement.
But we do hear from some officials of the administration that he's going to like to talk about free and fair, of course, open as well. But those are up to different interpretation, isn't it, Mr. Zindler, very briefly?
Yeah, it's very unclear exactly where they stand. Listen, during the campaign, Mr. Trump was extremely clear about his views that he thought that climate change was a hoax, which he even blamed on the Chinese for making up. But since then, the rhetoric has been much quieter, and he's certainly changed his position on a number of things since becoming president that were very different from the things that he said during the campaign. Mm-hmm. So it's really an open question where he's going to end up at this on this issue.
What do you think, Mr. Littlecott? One of the closest allies of the United States, that is the UK, but not necessarily on the climate change issue, is it?
No, I think the UK is obviously looking to defend what it sees as a special relationship with the US. That is in its early stages with new leaders on both sides. But the UK has been a very clear leader on climate change and will continue to want to drive that agenda in common with its partners in Europe, with Canada and with China. And I don't see that the UK is going to want to step back from its long-term commitments to the Paris Agreement purely because of the highfalutin rhetoric of the President Trump.
But Mr. Littlecott, since you've always been doing these advocacy work, so let me ask you, is there any magical remedy that the UK has to convince President Trump of the United States to still commit to what President Obama and his administration ever committed earlier?
Well, I don't think there's magic involved. I think there's a need for consistency and clear commitment to principles. When we look at the underlying structural challenges being faced, particularly in the electricity sector across the G7, we see that in all of the countries apart from Japan, all of the other countries are moving away from coal. And that's the underlying fundamentals. Whether President Trump thinks that he can magic clean coal into life is a completely different rhetorical question than the realities of where those sectors are moving.
Well,
so I think there's a much deeper relationship there which can be built on.
A much deeper relationship.
In respect to convincing him.
It is a much deeper relationship over there because that was part of his campaign promise. And that was also part of his so-called bringing back the job rhetoric for President Trump during his campaign. Professor Qi, of course, China at this point, as largest developing economy, also using coal a lot. Yet China is trying to commit to clean coal and also alternative energy. But what about the U.S. position? What would that mean for China, even though China is committed to Paris Accord?
I think no matter what the United States decide to do, China will deliver its commitment under the Paris Agreement, and also in the past we will be under the Copenhagen Accord. We'll see by the end of 2020, and China will exceed its commitment under the Copenhagen. So we're going to see China will reduce its carbon intensity by more than 50%, and China will make its promise and to keep its promise to deliver the Paris Agreement.
But you know, Professor Qi, many have been saying, well, if the United States doesn't do what it has already committed earlier, China is certainly having, quote-unquote, an upper hand over the United States in terms of so-called soft power, at least in relation to the climate change issue. Do you think that is the thing or the angle that China is looking at this question?
I think it's more complicated than that. If we were talking about before Copenhagen, and we probably see, China and the U.S. have this kind of relationship. They are looking at each other and decide what its own policy should be. At this moment, I think China sees there is a good relation between the better climate and the better economic growth. And actually, the United Kingdom has already shown in the past, ever since 1990, their emission has been cut by more than 40%, yet at the same time, their economy has been growing very fast. Last year, in the United States, the emission has decreased by 3%, and the GDP of the United States has increased. Same can be said for China. China decreased the carbon emission by 1% last year,
right,
with the GDP increased by more than 6.5%.
Are you ready to present all these numbers to President Trump if you got a chance to go to the G7?
I think the Trump, if he look at these numbers and the math, it's pretty clear what should be done.
What is clear right now, Mr. Zidler, is the politics right now in Washington, and that's what President Trump is looking at. Meanwhile, he's also looking at his campaign promises versus his current necessity, political necessities to do things. Mr. Zidler, he already cut back the budget for EPA. Also, scrap off some of the specific number of people working for EPA. Meanwhile, there has been different arguments coming from his administration and people related to it about the so-called scientific foundation of climate change. So it's already so far here. Does he have a way to go back at all?
So just a point of clarification, he hasn't actually been able to cut the budget yet for the EPA in the United States. Congress has to pass a budget. He's proposed to cut it, but whether Congress follows through on that is an open question. You're right that the issue around skepticism and the science of climate change has arisen again for the first time in the U.S. basically since more or less before the Obama administration, and that definitely has come more to the fore. But I would very much agree with your guest's comment a moment ago, which is that we've seen the United States essentially decarbonizing its power sector in particular. Over the last decade, we went from about half of our power coming from coal to about 30%. It's been a radical change, and we think that that's going to continue. There is an inherent momentum in the kind of decarbonization that we're seeing that frankly is not contingent on policy. It's going to happen to some degree anyway. So I think it's worth putting that in some context. There are larger changes with technology which are driving the energy sector forward in a very important way that really does not depend on what Mr. Trump decides.
That's exactly the question that I want to ask you, Mr. Littlecott. That is, you know, local level, at different states, it seems that the United States already is really out there trying to do things related to climate change. In the business level as well, because that means if they're not doing anything, the others going to catch up and they're going to do new technologies and the whole industry going to prosper without the participation of the United States. So the thing is, will that be able to convince the politics of Washington, which is now, right now, quite dominated by Republican, to say the least. The thing is whether that politics will work together with the realization of the importance and significance of climate change.
So that's a good question, and it's a similar debate to how we had for a while under the Bush administration, where both the presidency and the House were dominated by the Republican Party with a very clear anti-climate message and agenda. We saw that the UK and other international partners worked very closely at the state level with the private sector in the US, as you mentioned, to rebuild from the grassroots up that sense of momentum and real-world delivery. As we've already heard, the fundamentals of the US economy, particularly in the electricity sector, are moving in entirely the correct direction for action on climate change. Right. And actually, despite the rhetoric, leaders of the coal companies in the US have said directly to President Trump that they think he needs to calm down and temper his ambitions. They don't see that he will be bringing back jobs, and they don't think that he'll be opening new coal power plants. So while he's able to chip away at some of the environmental protections on the supply side, the demand for coal is going to continue to reduce.
We talk a lot about climate change. Who is at the risk of climate change? That is a question being debated quite a lot. If we could take a look at some of the specific numbers, the World Health Organization says most at risk are people living in megacities, small island nations, and disaster-prone areas. Countries with weak health systems will be least able to prepare and respond. And the most vulnerable are those living in poverty, as well as women, children, and elderly, and outdoor workers. Those are just some of the facts, but facts sometimes, Professor Chi, would not necessarily convince the politicians when they have a political agenda. Professor Chi, my question for you is, you know, this thing in the United States is very much linked to jobs. It's very much linked to how multilateral the U.S. international relations want to be, or rather bilateral, as President Trump argued during his campaign. Do you think this topic at this year's G7 summit would help us understand better about exactly where Trump administration is going, about its approaches to the outside world?
I think this is a very complicated issue. It does have this multitude of dimensions, and I don't think the G7 alone can actually resolve all these differences related to trade, to the economy, to the politics. But I think look at currently the worldwide, and we are experiencing this major technological revolution. We are experiencing this major industrial revolution. That means the jobs will come from these new sectors and new technology. I think all countries are now realize that there is a great opportunity to grasp, and that is where the economy will grow, and that is the opportunity we should seize. The coal industry, we know in the United States, we're talking about 75,000 jobs.
Yeah.
And the clean energy, wind and solar, we're talking about 165,000 jobs. When you compare the two, it's very obvious. I mean, this is not very complicated politics. It's a simple math, a simple arithmetic.
It is a simple math, but Professor Chi, we don't want to forget that, particularly Mr. Zindler, I'm sure you could weigh in here. That is, the jobs being created by the coal industry are the areas in which President Trump seemed to won his votes originally in the presidential campaign, and also likely to support him politically. Yet those new jobs be created are not necessarily for him politically important, particularly during the midterm election, which is coming next year, Mr. Zindler. So at this critical juncture, what do you think might be the choice from him?
Well, I think it's a very good point. Not all jobs are created equal as far as the politicians are concerned in the United States. And as you know, Mr. Trump won by an extremely narrow margin. And some of the more important states for him were states like Virginia and Ohio, where there are still some considerable number of coal jobs. That said, I do generally agree with what your other guest just mentioned a moment ago. If you do the math and you look at the long-term economic opportunity, it makes much more sense for the United States to be engaged in Paris. The reality of it is we're going to see a tremendous amount of growth of clean energy around the world. And by not being at the negotiating table, the U.S. misses the opportunity to have conversations with, say, sub-Saharan African countries and others that are going to be building a lot of renewable energy capacity over the next few decades. And by the way, I would argue that the Chinese understand that, and that is one of the opportunities that they see, the level of export of photovoltaic equipment and wind turbines that can happen into countries in sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere. They see that strategic opportunity. So I think if you take 3 steps back and you view Paris purely just from an economic interest perspective, the U.S. should decide to stay in. Now, whether or not that kind of rational thinking will go on at the White House, I certainly can't say.
Mr. Zindler, one of the things is very important, which is, you know, this is under the G7 mechanism. G7 is a platform of industrialized, remember that word? We haven't used that word for a long time, I guess. Industrialized economies, and the world has changed. It's about G20 now. So how much function can G7 play? Okay, if G7 cannot even deliver on the climate change issue, what is the point when it comes to coordination among the G7 nations, Mr. Zindler? I guess that is also an eligible question.
No, I think it's a very fair question. Listen, China is the #1 emitter of CO2 emissions, and China is not in that room today having these conversations over climate change. So I agreed that this group of nations on their own, and of course India is not there either, this group of nations on their own cannot come together and essentially solve the looming climate crisis. That said, I do think it's important that, you know, until last year, essentially, there were sort of degrees of differences among these 7 nations in terms of everyone generally had a commitment to want to do something something about it, and then it was kind of the question of what. We've now come to a different juncture where we have a new president where it's not clear that he really wants to do anything about it. So I think first, this group all getting on the same page is pretty important, so that when you do have a larger discussion, as is the case when the UN FCCC conversations resume again later this year, so that everybody is more on the same page.
We saw some of footages from last year's G20 and specific correlations. But having said that, though, Mr. Littlecott, I mean, G7 used to be the platform half of the world's GDP come from, but now it's not even a lion's share. So the significance of it, number-wise, has been diminishing. Meanwhile, if G7 nations during this specific summit would not be able to correlate with one another on the issue of climate change, many would question even further the existence of G7 and the point of it. Mr. Littlecott.
It's a nice provocative question. The G7 has many things on its agenda, and some of those things it is better at dealing with than others. And it has had cycles where it has struggled to come to agreement on climate. Again, going back to the Bush administration.
What is your answer to that question?
So I think we have to reflect on what the G7 is good at, is trying to find some of the leading norms which can inform the global conversation and inform global markets. And that's where the partnership between North America, Europe and Japan has traditionally been so powerful. But it's not the only vehicle for doing that. And I think it was really significant this week to see China, Canada and the EU coming together, reaffirming their commitment to be taking a much more proactive agenda on climate. And I think that shows that there are multiple ways of driving ambition in the climate sphere. We shouldn't expect the G7 to solve everything. And it doesn't even necessarily matter so much about what the specific text is coming out of this G7 summit. I think what's more important is how the other members of the G7 show that their continued commitment is going strong, regardless of whatever distractions are coming from the US.
Professor Chi, of course, nobody could enforce a rule or a thinking on the other countries. Everyone has to decide on their own. So what can be the takeaway, for example, for China, and you coming from China as a developing country, not member of the G7, for this specific summit and the future of the climate change, I guess?
I think China will watch the G7 real closely. Remember 2 years ago when G7 made that announcement and to decarbonize the world economy by the end of the century. That had a major impact on the conversation between President Xi Jinping and President Obama 4 months later. And that actually had major impact on the December 12th, 2015, the Paris Agreement. I think that I don't agree. I think whatever the G7 comes up really should have some major impact on the conversation worldwide.
All right. Professor Chi Ye, Mr. Ethan Zindler, and Mr. Chris Littlecott, thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Let's see what they're going to come up with at the end of this G7 summit. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Have a great weekend. You're watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Still to come on our program. Google computer AlphaGo has defeated the world's top Go player, but can robots go from outmatching humans in board games to outmatching them in the workforce? We're going to ask those questions. We'll come back. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live Monday to Friday on CGTN. The latest battle between human and machine happened here in China. Google's AI system AlphaGo won over Chinese world champion Ke Jie, a 90-year-old master of ancient Chinese board game known as Go. On Tuesday and Thursday, 2 games were held separately. AlphaGo beat Ke Jie with a score of 2-0. Despite 2 losses in a row for Ke, there is a chance, some argue, to win back some pride later in future games. Is that going to be true? Let's take a look at this.
The war between human and machine heats up. Ke is the world champion in Go, a Chinese game that's been played for thousands of years. But this grandmaster prodigy has been humbled by Google's AlphaGo program, beaten twice in the best-of-3 games, yet the player is gracious in defeat.
The first time we played, I thought it played a lot like a human. Now I feel like his game is more and more like the Go god. Really, it is brilliant.
This is the second time AlphaGo has bested the best. Last year, the AI program defeated 18-time world champion South Korea's Lee Sedol, though he won at least 1 game in the 5-game series. It shows the power of AI, which is developing fast. Some believe that in the near future, humans will no longer have to work because AI has more advantages than humans in automation, autonomous driving, synthetic intelligence, and executive function. It is replacing the work of human beings, fueling fears of mass unemployment. However, Google's parent company thinks there are opportunities rather than rivalries.
Regardless of the outcome of the match, humanity wins. And the reason is that this is not a contest of person and computer, but eventually it will be computer with person helping. The computer doing very good things and the person doing very good things.
Even though AlphaGo has beaten Ke, AI is, after all, the product of human ingenuity and imagination. It's developed, designed, and controlled under the guidance of humans. So no matter who wins, it is indubitably an advance in human innovation.
Well, that's a very diplomatic way of putting it right now about the result of the games. Will artificial intelligence and human being go head-to-head once again for the 3rd game? Who will win for that game? Let's ask our panelists in Beijing studio. Andy Mock, founder, president of Red Pagoda Resources. Welcome to our program. Meanwhile, joining us in Ithaca, New York State, we have Mr. Bart Selman, professor of computer science at Cornell University and also fellow of the American Association for Artificial Intelligence. Meanwhile, joining us in Washington, D.C., we have Mr. Chris Garlock, managing editor of American Go e-journal and a member of the American Go Association. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. I see some competitors among this group of panelists. Let me ask you, Mr. Garlock, coming from the Go Association. So it seems that Mr. Selman and his fellows are going to take away the jobs of the best Go players. Are you happy about that?
Oh, I think so. It's been, I got to tell you, really amazing. You know, Go is 4,000 years old, and you know, you would think there'd be nothing new under the sun with a game invented in China, by the way. But AlphaGo has really taught us so much. We're seeing new moves that we thought were bad moves that AlphaGo is showing us. Maybe they are good moves. We have top pros who are learning from AlphaGo. So it's a pretty exciting time for Go players.
Okay. Well, it seems that Mr. Garlock sounds diplomatic. He tried to say friendship first, competition second. But Mr. Selman, obviously, that is very different, shall I say, a motto for you and your colleagues.
Yeah, it's an amazing time for artificial intelligence. Techniques that weren't working up till a few years ago are suddenly starting to work. DeepMind is showing us amazing progress. And so there's an excitement in the field that we're starting to understand human intelligence, how to mimic it, with computers better and better. And we have a feeling that we're starting to get to the essence of intelligence and thinking, and are able to mimic it on machines.
All right.
It's an exciting time for AI. I do agree that the field, if you look at an area like Go, there will be a symbiosis that machines and computers can learn from each other. So there's definitely a positive aspect to it.
Professor Selman, you sound very cool-minded. So let me continue by asking you another question. How about that? That is, besides competing in the Go games, in the international chess games, what else really has artificial intelligence achieved over the past few years? Can you hear?
Yes, part of your question fell away. So you say the achievements of AI of the past few years?
Yes.
Yes. So the big change in the last 5 years, roughly, is that computers are now starting to able to hear and see us. People were not fully aware of this, but computer vision and speech recognition were very poor up till 5 years ago. So now what we're seeing, and this was really an enormous breakthrough in the field, computers are able to starting to see around us, see like humans see, starting to hear as humans can talk to them. And it's a similar technique as used in AlphaGo, learning from enormous amounts of data.
Yeah.
So that's starting to work, and there's a general sense in the field that now computers will be able to interact with us and learn how we perceive the world and how we act in the world, and that's making a major difference in our field. And this was unexpected.
Okay, Ke Jie, as you can see on the screen right now, the Go player keep on waving his head saying, well, I have done my best, but Mr. Mark, the last two games, was it a show? For commercial reasons? AlphaGo, after all, it's a company developed by Google, and this is the perfect timing to make it a commercial show. Or is it really that we are having a breakthrough of artificial intelligence that is likely to benefit us in so many different ways?
Well, I think Eric Schmidt has it right. That, I mean, humanity wins here in that this is an important milestone.
Depends on what kind of humanity you're talking about here.
Well, I think all of us do benefit. But it's important to point out that when we look at chess, we look at Go, these are examples of what's called perfect information games. And that's very different from dealing with a lot of human problems where most of the information is not known. There's another important development that I think points to some of the exciting breakthroughs in artificial intelligence in that computers have actually beat humans at poker now. And that's a better example of an imperfect information game, and we can see applications of things like negotiations, buying a house, where this is maybe the next generation of AI applications.
There are a lot of, gentlemen, wow effect. Wow, it could do this. Wow, artificial intelligence is coming. But you know what? We haven't seen much about how prepared we're getting as the human society, or shall I say, the humanity. How much have we prepared for a world in which we work with artificial intelligence, or let artificial intelligence work for us? I want to go back to you, Professor Selman, about that. Your job is not to challenge the human being, but rather how to better our future.
Yes, and I think you're raising a very important point. Society will need to prepare for these changes. A lot of jobs and a lot of work that people do currently will be better done by machines. Self-driving cars is a good example. They are already getting close to actually driving more safely and better and more consistently than humans, which puts at risk all transportation-related jobs.
Right.
We'll see changes in many different fields like that. Medical diagnosis, computers will probably outperform medical professionals. So it's an important issue to raise for people to become aware of. That society will change. It will be positive in many ways. That is, we actually have more leisure time, where we'll have to work less. But of course, we have to make sure that people are still feel meaningful and can be part of this society. And that's a challenge that governments and politicians and policymakers have to address together with researchers in AI.
And we have a specific example because Mr. Garlock is sitting here with us. I mean, from now on, how can you be encouraging to many of your friends in the Go field? I mean, they would say, after all, the computer beat us. What can we do? Even if we come up with some of the magic remedies to solve the current problem, the computer going to learn overnight, and they're going to beat us again. What is the point? They would ask, Mr. Garlock.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You know, they said that, of course, with Deep Blue, and somehow people are still playing chess and enjoying chess. And the other wonderful thing about the game of Go is that, yes, in Go, somebody wins and somebody loses. But Go is a cooperative game. You know, we are working together, the two players, to create the most beautiful game. Yes. I don't have to wipe you out as my opponent. I can, and in fact, the first game this week was won by half a point by AlphaGo, and that's what we really want, is a beautiful game in which we learn things. And so I think that what my AI colleagues have been talking about apply to the game as well. And of course, you know, we want to win and we prefer to win, but there's a saying that you often, the best things that you learn are when you lose. And so I think maybe winning and losing is maybe not quite as important as people think.
Mr. Garlock, what you have just said reminds me of the legends related to the Go game thousands of years ago. It is not just about win and lose. It is about the human spirits behind a competition. Some of the biggest legends of Go players even suggest that they do not want to win over the opponent in a big way. They just want to win 51%. That's it. Just a little to win.
That's right.
And yet give the other party enough space to maneuver and enjoy as well. That is a kind of level, spiritual level that we're talking about here. Mr. Garlock, do you think that part will still be with us? Do you think this, you know, computers playing the game likely to overall transform the spirit of the game?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. In fact, I'm reminded another wonderful Chinese art that you've given us is Tai Chi, and it's a similar thing in Tai Chi as in Go. You know, the emphasis is on balance. If you're too aggressive in Tai Chi, just as if you're too aggressive in Go, you often wind up losing. So you have to be patient, you have to be balanced, you have to really enjoy to play Tai Chi or to play Go. And there's a saying in Tai Chi that I think applies here, which is you must invest in loss. You invest in loss, which is it's a little odd for us in the West to think about investing in loss, but I think that it applies. Again, you learn the most when you lose. Again, we want to win, of course, we want to win, but it's more important to play.
Yeah, but you know what, Mr. Garlock, when you are talking, Mr. Selman, Professor Selman, in fact, keep on nodding his head. That means he's also learning about that, and he's gonna put all of these lifelong learning skills to those AIs that they're gonna know in the future. So it's not just the human spirit anymore. But putting that aside, Mr. Mark, what Mr. Garlock just said, is that self-comforting of human being we were doing to ourselves, that, you know, we are always better than machines. They will never learn a certain part of us. And we are always gonna be the future of the world. But the question fundamentally is it still gonna be true? Will AI take on life of its own, Mr. Mark?
Well, I think it already is taking a life of its own, just as we see in the Industrial Revolution, automation of machinery reduced the need for human labor.
You sound so calm while you're talking about that.
Yes, but I think that, you know, the guest from the Go Association makes a great point that part of life is about experiencing things, but part of it is utilitarian, getting things done efficiently. And I think AI will definitely help us with the latter, making life more efficient.
Yeah.
But it might also create new opportunities for richer life experiences as well.
Well, but Professor Selman, while you are working on the AI, what are the human beings going to do? Of course, our job's going to be different in the future because certain jobs going to be, you know, AI do it. We just sit around and do other things. But how? That is the biggest question mark. Are we going to have, Professor Selman, a division of labor? Well, some of you are working on AI, while others can be here looking for the future of human beings when it comes to jobs, when it comes to the way of thinking, and when it comes to our philosophy as well, Professor Selman.
Yes, I think it's actually it's a very exciting time both for AI and for humans. So we will discover new capabilities or creativity of the human mind, human interaction. So people often ask me, what jobs are not so much at risk? Well, one important area of activities is human interaction and the way humans relate to each other. We will always have a preference, I believe we'll always have a preference to interact with other humans, and so professions that deal with caregiving or deal with teaching human to human, there are lots of activities that humans will remain unique in, especially since we are human and a unique organism.
I see.
So I actually think we'll discover new things that we are good at and will complement the machines. And the machines might actually take care of the more mundane things in our lives.
Okay, before we go.
So we should keep the positive. Yeah.
Before we go, we only have 30 seconds left. Everyone from you, the three, who is going to win for the last game of the series of 3? Okay, Andy, your bet.
I think it'll be 2-1.
All right, you say it? Okay. Bart, Mr. Bart.
2-1, one for the humans, yeah.
And Chris.
Oh, I'd like to agree with my colleagues, but I got to say it's going to be AlphaGo. I think it's going to be 3-0. Sorry, guys.
All right.
We can only hope.
Okay.
No matter which side you bet on, gentlemen, have a great weekend, and we're going to enjoy that game on Saturday. Thank you so much for joining us. Chris Garlock, Bart Selman, and Andy Mock. Thank you. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of our program, try to find us World Insight CGTN with Tian Wei into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo as well. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight with Tian Wei team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next week for more insights across China and around the world. Have a great weekend, everybody.